This is Captain E, and I want to tell you about a charity that is near and dear to my heart. The Shawn Jenkins Children's Hospital at MUSC is responsible for saving my niece's life and so many others on a daily basis. Hooked on Miracles is our King Mackerel Tournament in Charleston on July 14th through the 16th, and it's the oldest King Mackerel Tournament in South Carolina. We support the Children's Hospital with 100% of our proceeds. This event is a fun-filled weekend of fishing with family and friends and raising money for this great cause. You can make a difference, too, by going to www.hookedonmiracleskmt.com and join our efforts as a sponsor or participant. That's www.hookedonmiracleskmt.com for all the information. Thanks to all of our sponsors and especially Key West Boats for keeping this great event going every year. We'll see y'all in Charleston in July. Michelob Ultra and Mick Ultra Wholesaler Better Brands Incorporated are excited to announce a new partnership with Sober Skipper, part of the Sea-Tow Foundation. While we know consumers enjoy relaxing days on the water with ultras in hand, it's important to remember to drink and boat responsibly. Choose to be or to designate a sober skipper before leaving the dock. Do it for your family and friends, your passengers, and everyone else on board. Michelob Ultra salutes all sober skippers who take the pledge. Cheers, and we'll see you on the water.
Realtree has always had a connection to the fishing industry and the outdoor lifestyle. In 2016, Realtree expanded on the traditional business of creating the world's most effective camouflage patterns to create a fishing brand and family of patterns designed to connect the woods to the water and strengthen the bond between the two worlds. We couldn't be more excited to be working with the industry's top brands, retailers, and anglers to continue our growth, and we hope that you will join us. Enjoy Realtree fishing patterns inshore, offshore, on the lake, or at the dock. Learn more about the extensive line Realtree fishing patterns, apparel, gear, and more at Realtree.com.
One thing that all of us outdoorsmen and women love to do is travel, whether to fish new waters or to chase wild game in other areas that we may not get opportunities at in our own area. Our friends at Monster Reservations Group want to open up an entirely new chance for you to travel and enjoy the outdoors or just relaxing. With over 40 destinations in the U.S. like beautiful Gatlinburg, Tennessee, Wisconsin Dells and Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, Poconos, Pennsylvania, and even our backyard here at Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And many more. They are going to give you twice the vacation. That's right. Pay for 4 nights and you're going to get 4 nights for free. That's $498 for an 8-night stay at one of our incredible destinations, and that's for simply listening to Trilogy Outdoors. Go book your trip and get all the details at www.monsterrg.com. That's monsterrg, all lowercase.com. Pay less for an incredible opportunity to explore the outdoors in your choice of over 40 destinations. Book your trip now.
Trilogy Outdoors.
All right, folks, it is Senator Stephen Goldfinch and Captain E here with Trilogy Outdoors. And today's show, I'm going to turn this little intro over to Stephen because, you know, we've tried to do everything outdoors. And I'm talking hunting, fishing, what you said, paleontology. We're going to even dive into that. We're going to dive into everything. History of South Carolina as an outdoorsman is very important. As myself wanting to know the history of fishing here, hunting, and everything else. You've lined up pretty much one of the foremost experts on the history of everything South Carolina.
I think it's pretty undeniable. Dr. Walter Edgar is the historian for South Carolina. Everybody knows him by Dr. Walter Edgar's journal. He's on public radio. He's written numerous books, including the comprehensive history of South Carolina. I think it's actually called South Carolina, A History by Dr. Walter Edgar. And just a fascinating guy. I was talking with Captain E a little while ago, and I said, you know what, if you just say, hey, Dr. Edgar, what happened in 1633? He would have an hour to talk to you. So, you know, the time that we have today with him will be too short, but I promise you, we're going to have a part deux.
Yep. I think we're definitely going to have 2 parts. You know, here's the thing, man. When you came to me with this idea of this podcast, of course, there's podcasts popping up every 20 minutes from somebody. I'm like, well, you know, we do a radio show, and that's really easy. You get people on there and interview them, but there's commercials inside of it. You're taking breaks. You really don't talk as long. When we sat down and started doing these, and they're now running over an hour, and we're having to stop. because of that, it's easy to say that we're getting a good lineup of guests,
And
all of them.
And we're able to dive in on a topic. Like, I mean, you can really dive in on a topic. Like, I mean, who would ever think that we dive in on a topic like South Carolina history?
Yeah, exactly.
Who would ever think we're going to dive in on a topic like South Carolina paleontology or archaeology? We got an underwater archaeologist coming to talk to us about the shipwrecks of South Carolina, which is fascinating on a couple of different levels, from the fisheries standpoint, but also just from the history.
Yep.
I mean, we have an unbelievable lineup of people. And you know what? You said something a little while ago. It said, you said, I think it's going to be interesting to you. I don't care if it's interesting to you or not.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I want you to listen. But it's interesting to me.
Yeah.
And I know it's interesting to you, and I think we produce a better show than most people if we do something we love, we're passionate about, and that we like to hear, because you can hear it in us that we're interested in it, and I think that'll
Absolutely. I think you're right on that. I think the whole thing being is the fact that us as the interviewer, host, whatever you want to call it, have that taste for whatever our guest has to share with us. And I'm saying, from Jim Shockey, which, when we had Jim on, I mean, I'm sitting back and really, I'm just like want to take the headphones off and just sit back, because listening to y'all relate to your times in the wild, albeit, I would say in a desert or in a wherever y'all ventured to.
Yeah,
for me, it was great to sit back. It's great to sit back and listen. Things that I may never experience, but that I may experience. But to hear that from y'all, I mean, just to talk to Senator Campson about all of the incredible things that go on in politics here in South Carolina relating to wildlife and relating to the natural resources. And I never really got to say it in that interview, but I will say it now, that one thing I think that sets South Carolina apart from North Carolina, our neighbors right across the state line, and I think it's very important, and I've heard the arguments, both sides of this, but I'm going to say that I think it's important, is the fact that our governing body, for most of our changes that are done, and if not all of our changes that are done for the resources, are done directly from the constituents. And I say that in a sense that you represent me. You know that. You represent me. I look at it like that. Like, when everything comes up, I mean, that's how you and I really first became friends, was when changes started happening, and you would reach out. Like, who do I need to talk to? What's your opinion? Let's do this. In North Carolina, they've got, is it elected or their boards appointed? What's the fisheries or game management board, or how is that?
So the legislature in a lot of states, not in all states, but in a lot of states, have nothing to do with fish and game.
Exactly.
And you hear, I have often heard from people that think that's a good thing. You need to get the General Assembly, you need to get the legislature out of fish and game rules, regulations, laws. And I've always felt that was a little bit short-sighted, and I'll tell you why. If you believe that a person that is faceless, I was trying to come up with the right word for that. I think faceless is the right.
Right.
If you think that a faceless, unelected bureaucrat that may have a bias against hunting is the right person to make rules and regulations for hunting, then by all means throw me out of the system.
Right.
Okay? But if you think that me and 170 other people that are elected by you to do the right thing, and when we don't do the right thing, it's your job to throw us out. If you think that's the better system, then I'm your guy.
Yep.
Then I'm your guy, because I can promise you, I know those people inside of the Fish and Game departments, the departments of natural resources across the country, and a lot of them don't have your best interest at heart.
No.
Some of them do. Okay, I don't want a blanket statement that they don't, but some of them don't. Some of them believe it's better for us not to be involved in hunting and fishing. Some of us believe it's better to just let wildlife be.
So the argument to come back on that is, I mean, without a doubt, the argument to come back, this is getting right to my conversation that I had with the individuals in North Carolina that I went up there duck hunting with. They were saying, they are commercial crabbers, they're commercial fishermen, and they do duck guide service up there. And they were saying that, oh no, we would never want our politicians making these decisions. No way. And I'm like, well, why? Because at the end of the day, the way it's set up, just because two, even 10 or 20 or more may have that thought that they don't agree with hunting and don't agree with fishing, they're still not going to have the power to make that change without the numbers behind them.
You got to have the rest of the General Assembly, and there will become. Senator Campson made mention of this. That there will emerge people in the General Assembly in politics that make that their focus, that know that industry inside and out. Senator Campson and I tend to be, and there may be one or two others, but Senator Campson and I tend to be two people that know this business inside and out. Fisheries, fish, game, forestry. We know it inside and out. And there are a lot of people in the General Assembly that don't, that rely on us for good information. And so I pride myself, and I know Senator Campson does, prides himself in being a conveyor of true, accurate, honest information, whether you like it or not.
Right.
We can do it. But I'm telling you right now, there are people, there are forces and movements inside fish and game departments that don't have the hunter or the fisherman's best interest at heart. And that's a scary thing. If you want to move those policies over to them.
It is a scary thing. And I know we're going to have a great show, a great interview there here with Dr. Edgar coming up right here in a minute. And it's going to talk a little bit about the history of the hunting and fishing in South Carolina,
and the General Assembly and how South Carolina came to be.
At some point in time, I know whitetail deer were almost wiped out completely.
Yeah, anecdotally, we've all heard 100 years ago there was no white-tailed deer, and we're going to ask Dr. Edgar about that and the commercial hunting and how that came to be. But certainly, if you look back 100 years ago, you don't see a lot of black and white photos of deer. You see a lot of pictures of turkeys, a lot of pictures of quail and ducks, but you don't see a lot of pictures of deer 100 years ago. You don't start seeing pictures of deer until 50 or so years ago. Today, we are blessed to be talking with Dr. Walter Edgar, who is a famous Southern historian, South Carolina historian, and we've been looking forward to having this interview for a while. Dr. Edgar, welcome to the show.
I'm delighted to be on. I've been looking forward to it as well.
You know, you and I have sort of run in some similar circles over the years and crossed paths a couple times, but we've never really had an opportunity to really truly sit down and just have a conversation. So this is going to be great fun for me. I oftentimes when sitting at a dinner table or sitting around a conference table will remember something from your book, A History of South Carolina, and say, have you read Dr. Edgar's book, A History of South Carolina? Did you know X, Y, or Z? And a lot of times people will look at me like I've got two heads because there's just so much that they didn't, that people don't know about our own history. And that's a little bit sad in some ways, but you have been working in the history world for, 40, you were a professor at USC for 40 years?
I was at USC for 40 years, and I've continued, so I guess a half century now at least.
You're an emeritus professor now?
I retired from Carolina in 2012.
Right.
Yes, after 40 years.
Wow, incredible history you've had yourself. So, how did you get interested in the study of history and specifically Southern history?
Well, I grew up in Mobile, Alabama. You know, that's the dark secret. I'm not a native South Carolinian. But as I tell people who are native, I made the choice. You didn't have a choice. I had a choice, and I chose to live here.
Good choice.
But I grew up in a family where history was part of the dinner conversation. Of course, this is the late 1940s, early 1950s. And so on Sunday afternoon, our family would take road trips. In the summer, one of our favorite places to go was to Fort Morgan, the Civil War fort that's over on the other side of Mobile Bay. It was not then a state park. It was basically abandoned, and you could, as kids, you could play all sorts of games you wanted to your heart's content. And right there, driving into Fort Morgan, this is late 1940s, there was still sandbags at every intersection because they'd been manned during World War II to guard against the possibility of Germans landing submarines. There were watchtowers in the pine trees. So my grandfather would say, son, I can tell you about 4 different wars as we come to this one particular place. That was just part of what I grew up with, and lots of books. Both my grandmothers saw to that I had plenty to read growing up.
Yeah, well, that's sort of what sparked the fire in you, and I know exactly what you mean. People oftentimes will say, what did you do as a kid? And we played sports, and we sat around the breakfast room table and talked about football, and for me, sitting around the breakfast room table was talking about politics. So. Yep. For you, history. For me, politics. My grandfather was in the General Assembly also and a judge here in South Carolina, and we just loved to talk about politics and debate politics as a kid, and I always found it fascinating. It was just family time for me, but it developed into a passion, and so I know exactly what you're talking about, and that's sort of the beginnings of where we are now, I guess.
Well, when you were growing up, you probably lived in what was then the old 6th Congressional District, right?
That's right. Yes, sir.
And politics in the 6th District were always interesting back then.
They say politics in South Carolina is a blood sport.
Well, it's been said that for several centuries. But anyway, since you're from that part of the 6th District, one of the things I used to have students do when they took my South Carolina history class is I would give them a blank map of the state. The county lines would be out there, and I would say, okay, ladies and gentlemen, you've got 10 minutes to, first of all, you locate your county, then identify as many counties as you possibly can. Invariably, at least in the 1970s into the early 1980s, kids who were from the PD, but particularly the old 6th District, they almost always got every one of their counties right.
Right.
It was amazing, but that was because of it was such an interesting place, and certainly in terms of politics back then.
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. I can remember vividly. My grandfather, of course, was a Democrat, or back then a Dixiecrat, and during those days. But became a Democrat, and today certainly would be different than what you would imagine the traditional Democrats being. But he participated in a lot of those stumps, especially the Gallows Ferry stump, right? I mean, and I had heard a number of stories from traveling around the state and getting on those stumps, and he told me something interesting one time. I actually brought it up, I think, in the last podcast with Senator Campson, or maybe the podcast with Senator Davis. I can't remember which, but he had told me a story one time. This had to have been in the 60s or early 70s before he retired, that he had been given a set of Cadillac keys, car keys, in the General Assembly. He had been given a set of keys, brand new Cadillac. And he said, it was the happiest day of my life. I'd been given a brand new Cadillac for nothing, and then I found out what I had to do to keep it. And he said, it turned into the saddest day of my life. I had to give the keys back. So I'm sure you, having lived through lost trust and all that, are very familiar with politics in South Carolina.
Well, yes. And as you said, they've been a blood sport. And the stump meetings, which you mentioned, were legendary. I mean, they did continue into the 1960s, but then television kind of did them in.
Right.
But if you were running for statewide office, you had to go. There was a stump meeting in every county. You had to go.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the one here continues, doesn't it? The one in Gallivan's Ferry continues?
It does.
Yeah, the one here continues, doesn't it? The one in Gallivan's Ferry
It does,
continues?
but they used to begin at Gallivan's Ferry, and then they would be all around the state. That was it. That was everybody's entertainment. You know, they didn't have 300 television channels or iPads or what have you. Yeah. And people would get out, and it was, you know, there was always a barbecue. It was a social event as well as a political event, and people would come from, usually in county seats. Obviously, Gallivan's Ferry is not the county seat, but in many cases there were. And folks would come from miles around and spend half a day listening to politicians and making their opinion known of certain politicians. So,
loudly in some cases, yes.
That's why I told my partner here, Senator Goldfinch, that he would be so good for a podcast, radio, or TV, is because Senator Goldfinch, I mean, he's so good for a podcast, great out there in that world. And now he gets to talk about things that he's passionate about, not the things that he has to talk about. Now he gets to talk about things that he's passionate about. And that's why we've enjoyed talking outdoors and everything else on the podcast, and that's why we through the radio show and such. But I've always been intrigued by the swamp fox. I'm just going to say I started listening to some of your stuff this morning. I started where you had done some of your stuff this morning. Some stuff talking about Francis Marion, the swamp fox. I was always intrigued by him. Talking about Francis Marion, the swamp fox. I was always intrigued.
I'm a good bit older than both of you gentlemen, and I'm back in the 1950s. Disney had a TV show, The Swamp Fox, starring a very young Leslie Nielsen.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Wow.
As the Swamp Fox. Horrible, horrible introduction to a song about Swamp Fox, where is he at? And something going on like that. I mean, it was just, but it ran for a half an hour, and it was all, in those days, a half an hour show was a half an hour. So you had 30 minutes of the Swamp Fox once a week. And he was, you know, Marion was really and truly a national hero, certainly up until the Civil War. He was right up there with George Washington. I mean, Parson Weems wrote that famous tales about George Washington. He wrote one about Francis Marion. Of course, he stole General O'Ree's notes, but he wrote one about Francis Marion. The poets in Boston were writing songs of Marion's men. About the Battle of Utah Springs. He was really a big deal, and there wasn't any PR company putting it out. He was who he was, and the word spread throughout the countryside and the country, literally.
Now, is that because the nation needed sort of a hero at the time? I mean, my understanding of the history of that time was that, you know, we were losing the war. And the nation needed somebody to sort of lean on as their hero. Obviously, George Washington was, you know, one of those guys. But, I mean, Francis Marion was actually putting some wins under his belt, while the rest of them were not, correct?
Well, that's right. But his real fame nationally came after the war because of what he had done. And, yes, you are right that the Southern campaign, people were looking for victories, and they were getting them more down here than they were anywhere else. I mean, why do you think Cornwallis's army was in such bad shape by the time it got to Yorktown?
Right.
It had been beat up here in South Carolina.
You know, you hear this.
Lost over half his.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you know, you hear this. At least as a South Carolinian, I'd always heard this from, you know, my family, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I've always heard that you really would not have had the nation, or you really may not have had a nation at all. I was going to say the nation that we have, but you wouldn't have had a nation at all had it not been for South Carolina in the Revolutionary War. Do you find that to be an over-exaggeration?
Perhaps a little bit, but the American Revolution was won in the South. It was not won in Pennsylvania or New Jersey. Yes, there were some famous battles up there, but the British planned to sweep up the southern colonies in 1780 and 1781, and then basically say we've got the most valuable colonies, you can have Boston and Philadelphia, New York, and that's why General Clinton landed his forces to take Charleston, and the plan was to sweep up through Virginia and end the revolution. Well, he left very quickly and left Cornwallis in charge, and Cornwallis got his beat here in South Carolina, primarily by people like Francis Marion, Andrew Pickens, Thomas Sumter. Sumter is famous. He wasn't quite as good a military man as he liked people to think. Great recruiter. But the real genius in fighting partisan war, today we would say guerrilla warfare, irregular warfare, was Francis Marion.
Exactly.
And so when you're looking at South Carolina as a whole, I mean, we start. I mean, where do you I have often sort of struggled wrapping my head around where you start, right? Like, I mean, where do you start this history of South Carolina? And one of the places that I tend to start, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I tend to start around Lucas Vasquez de Leon, and his attempted, I guess you could call it a colony, his attempted colony in Winyaw Bay that ultimately failed. I think that was 1525, 1526. But, I mean, that's sort of where I start. Do you start somewhere different?
No, 1526 in terms of European exploration is right. Although sad to say, most archaeologists now don't put Alion's colony in Winyaw Bay. If we can keep it still in South Carolina, down in Beaufort County, we'll be lucky that it keeps looking now, it's moving further south based upon documents that keep coming up. But the Spanish did come into South Carolina in the 1520s. Of course, De Soto marched through here, but you can actually go further back. There is human settlement documented in South Carolina to go back 15,000 years.
Sure.
Wow.
15,000 years.
So that would have been Clovis or pre-Clovis? I can't remember which.
Those are archaeological terms. I know what you're talking about, the points. I'm not sure, but it's 15,000 years.
That's a long time.
And in fact,
it's a long time.
Long time.
Yeah.
A long time ago. And in fact, coiled pottery, which Native Americans made, archaeologists now trace it to the Savannah River Valley. So we're talking about pretty important spots in terms of human history in this part of the world.
Well, and that history, I mean, I shouldn't say obviously, but I mean, that history seems to be history that came from Western expansion, right? I mean, the expansion of prehistoric people came from the west to the east, correct?
That is correct, but there are some, and that's not, the archaeologists really and anthropologists really get into this. Did people come from the east, sail across the Atlantic? Well, we know the Vikings did and what have you, but were there any others? But yes, the Native Americans that you were talking about, the Clovis and the pre-Clovis, the settlements in over there in Sumter County, Kershaw County, they were mound builders.
Right.
You've got woodland Indians, and then you get more settled Indians. And one of the things that is, I think, amazing about the Native Americans in South Carolina is there were 40 to 45 distinct Native American tribes, and they use the term tribe now. 25 years ago, when I was writing the history, the term was, they talked about nations, but now they refer to themselves as tribes. And they're so easy to teach, because all I got to tell somebody, and I'm sure you've done this too, is look at the names of our rivers.
Right.
They're named after Waccamaw, PD. Winyaw is actually a corruption. The original translation was Weenie. And notice how much of those Indian names Europeaners gave them a double E, Santee,
Right.
Wampee. I mean, so
Yeah. So have you ever shot in the dark here? I've never figured out whether or not it's accurate or not. I think Judge Maring may have written about it in his book. He wrote a history book about Winyah Bay. I think it was actually a historical novel. So, but have you ever heard of a tribe called the Fish People that lived off of Winyah Bay?
well, are you talking about the ones that the Spaniards?
Correct.
Yeah, that. Oh gosh, the Native American they took back to Spain, Francisco de Chicora.
That's it.
And yes, they were large, fish eating, and they had hard tails, so they had to dig a hole to sit down. And so, I mean, that was chronicled in Spanish records. Now, when the lizard man of Lee County started roaming around a few years back,
Yeah.
I had some students from the PD that I think they may have learned a history lesson and decided to have some fun. I don't know, because the description of the lizard man is exactly the way Francisco Chicora described those fish eaters. Large, scaly creatures with a hard tail. And they died out because they couldn't get enough fish to eat. Now, that's where it really kind of beggars the imagination. But anyway.
I always wondered if if they were dressed in garb that that he was describing, rather. I mean, obviously not physical attributes, but I mean, I always wondered if it was paint and garb that he was describing rather than physical biological attributes.
Well, the Spaniards took it down as physical, as literal.
Huh.
They really had hard tails.
Interesting.
So,
Interesting.
You know.
Interesting. I had read an account. There's a very interesting book, not Bridger, but another one of the Western pioneers had met a trapper who had crossed the Waccamaw River from Charleston into what would now be today Hobcall Barony, and had supposedly run into a group of Indians that were 6 foot tall and light skinned with green or blue eyes, and there's an account of this written down somewhere that I read years ago, and it was fascinating to me because my immediate connection was to D'Eon, and the lost colony, and obviously these people had interbred, and I mean that was my theory on it, and I've never heard anybody else's take on it. I didn't know if you had ever heard of that.
Not in South Carolina. There's long been a tradition that the Lumbee just across the border are the descendants from the lost colony.
Ah, okay. Gotcha.
But not from Allion, because Allion's expedition ended in a disaster, and he died, and they pulled up stakes and went back to the Caribbean. But when DeSoto came through, his men did find in Native American villages pieces of Spanish armor and that kind of thing. So,
and that was how many years later?
That was about, he was in the 1560s. So you're talking 40 years later.
40 years later, they were finding Spanish armor.
Yeah. And of course, the lasting legacy of the Spanish through South Carolina was disease, measles, smallpox. By the time the English came, probably a third of the Native American population had been killed off by disease.
Right.
So,
I read an interesting book. You would think Jared Diamond wrote it, but it wasn't Jared Diamond. It was a professor from Mesa University in Colorado. He wrote the comprehensive history of the mosquito. And it was just an unbelievable book. I mean, you would think that sounds boring as it can be, but the mosquito has truly shaped the history of the world in every way imaginable. And he goes through all the various ways, and South Carolina certainly no exception to that, right? I mean, South Carolina, we've been living with these monsters from the beginning of time, but I can only imagine. I always tell people this. I can only imagine. You know, when I'm on a barrier island in October, fishing for bullfish, bull redfish, or if I take the kids to Cedar Island, in the summertime to play or whatever, and you just get swarmed by flies and mosquitoes. And I always say, God, I can't imagine Bull Island, for instance, terrible this year with mosquitoes. Cannot imagine what it would have been like to land here in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, and try to make a life. It's just amazing to me that you wouldn't just turn around and go home.
Well, not only that, not just the everything, mosquitoes, flies, the no-see-ums.
Yeah.
But think of the terrain, just the geography and the shrubbery, the plants, so many strange things. Yeah, they knew what an oak tree was, but they didn't know what cypress trees were. And of course, over in the PD, that area, the Blackwater rivers, they thought there's something really sinister about that. I mean, we all know why there's black water, but if you're coming from Europe, they may have muddy rivers, but they don't have black. Clear and black, that's obviously something evil going on.
Right. Never seen alligators before.
No. And we do have descriptions from the early English settlers on the size of things like crabs. They talk about Atlantic crabs being over 12 inches across. Now that's
a big crab.
It's been a long time since I don't think, well, maybe as a child I saw some in the Gulf, but that's pretty big. And they talk about the meat of oysters being as big as a man's hand. Now, that's not the case anymore, clearly. And of course, the early settlers thought that oysters was what you feed poor people because, you want to eat that thing? I do all the time.
Well, we do now, but you got to think about it. Who was the first person to decide to eat it?
I want to know who the first person is, for real.
Brave guy. Right?
Yeah.
Brave guy. I mean, I love him now, but I can't imagine him being the first.
Yeah.
Making that decision.
Yeah.
And of course, obviously the Native Americans, because of all the shell mounds we've got throughout the Low Country.
I lived.
Knew that.
I lived in Allendale years ago. Lived in Allendale, a house overlooked Bulls Bay, and I could see one of the shell mittens if you looked hard off to the north of me. And those places also, that would have been the Siwi Indians, I guess, right? That made the majority of shell mittens in that area.
Well, the Siwi were there, but you also had the Waccamaw and the Santee. A lot of those small coastal tribes, by the first generation of English settlement, had either they weren't much bigger than a large family, extended family, like 40 or 50 people. So you're not talking about huge numbers. And they began to combine, and the Santee and some of these other Indians moved up country and joined the Catawbas. The Catawbas welcomed, as they said, the remnant tribes from the coast. But the Siwis, built canoes, but large seagoing canoes. They thought they were going to deal with the English traders on the other side of the water.
Gosh, I can't imagine. I've heard that before, but I just can't imagine getting in a canoe and paddling out into the Atlantic Ocean, hoping to hit land at some point in time. I mean, that just takes some cojones, doesn't it?
Well, that is a true story. They did.
And then,
of course, they never came back. Right.
And 3 or 4 days in, and you realize you're not going to hit land. Gosh, how scary would that be? So obviously, these guys had to feed themselves, and from Native Americans all the way up to to the mid-17 to the Revolutionary War. People had to feed themselves. My understanding was that there was actually bison in South Carolina up until the mid-1700s. Is that right?
Did you say famine?
Bison. I'm sorry, bison.
Oh, bison. I'm sorry. Excuse me. I'm hard of hearing, so I may have to ask you to repeat some things.
Me too.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
We all three are. That makes three of us.
Yeah, no problem.
We all three
yes,
are.
There were bison. They were in the
up
country. In fact, many of the Indian trails, which white settlers then transferred into roads, like number 6 out of Charleston. In the upcountry, they were originally buffalo trails, bison trails. We've got drawings of them from the 17th, early 18th century.
So when did they die out? Or kill out?
They were never that many, but they were good to eat.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
they disappeared.
I've often wondered what the main food source would have been for Native Americans and early settlers. So if it wasn't bison, it would have been what? Deer?
Deer, bird life, fish. The Native Americans made you. I mean, the animal life here in South Carolina was incredible.
So if you were if you were an early settler, or even a Native American, let's just say early settler, if you were an early settler and you had you had picked Georgetown, South Carolina as your place to settle, and you had your little 40 acres somewhere, what would you do on a day-to-day basis? I mean, you'd try to make a living farming? Did you try to make a living hunting and gathering? I mean, what? Obviously.
Well,
go ahead.
All right. First of all, if you came to South Carolina as an independent settler, depending upon when it was in the colonial period, you either got 50 or 100 acres.
Okay.
The colonial government was very generous with giving out land. And let's just say you're coming with your wife and you got 3 children. Well, you get 100 acres for you, and then you get 50 acres for everybody else in your family. If one of those is a boy who's 15 or 16, you're going to get an extra 50 acres. If you're bringing indentured servants or enslaved people with you, you're going to get 100 acres for them. So getting land was fairly easy. Trying to figure out what to do with it was another thing. The early colonists experimented with all sorts of cash crops because they wanted that, but they already were growing their own vegetable gardens, if you will, importing vegetables from seeds from Europe, but also picking up, hey, squash, beans, corn. They picked that up from the Native Americans.
But these crops you mentioned, the vegetable garden crops, they wouldn't have looked the way they look today, though, right? I mean, these would have been very different looking squash or corn than we have, right?
Oh, yeah. The corn would be the cobs would have been very small, and the beans would probably be closer to some of them we would recognize, but the squash were more gourd-like than what we've got now. There have been some wonderful studies done fairly recently on heirloom crops, the crops that were growing in South Carolina back in the colonial period. And in many ways, they tasted better than what we've got now, especially something like a watermelon. The watermelons that were produced up until the 20th century were far sweeter. The only problem was they didn't transport very well for the market, so they got bred to have a really thick skin. And then, of course, they bred the seeds out of them. So, I mean, I'm sure both of you guys grew up. If you had watermelon as a kid, you got into a seed spitting contest, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Of course.
You can't do that now.
A lot of them don't have them.
Some of them have those little. Now, you don't have them.
Yeah.
So the people who came out here were pretty sturdy. They were intending to make South Carolina succeed. And I've often described them as, kind of swashbuckling. They were hard-nosed folks, and they didn't like anybody telling them what to do. And the first time, in 1719, they had a rebellion against the Lords Proprietors, the first real revolution in what's now the United States. They threw out the government that the proprietors had created. Of course, they asked the king to come in, and they regretted that 50 years later. But
and you're going to have to. So I think I understand what the proprietors were. The proprietors were the first sort of group of what you would call government in South Carolina prior to there being a formal government that they came with certain rights and privileges. Talk about that for a minute so that we understand the foundation before we move on.
All right. King Charles II, when he recovered the English throne after, the English they'd killed the king, but then Charles II, the royal family came back, and the people that helped him regain the throne included 8 men that he gave this tremendous land grant to. They weren't the only ones who got proprietary grants. Maryland was a proprietary colony. Pennsylvania was a proprietary colony. But South Carolina, the original Carolina grant stretched from the Virginia state, what's now the Virginia North Carolina state line, all the way down to the St. Mary's River. And it went from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And I just think about that. Almost all the half of the southern United States was in that original land grant.
Huge piece of land.
And these 8 men were given all sorts of authority that would normally belong to the king, including the power of life and death over people. But they were the ones who set up the initial colony, provided the officials to rule the colony, as it were. But the people who were ruling in their name turned out to be, some of them, pretty sleazy. And so in 1719, the colonists rebelled and petitioned the king to take over South Carolina and rule it efficiently. So
right.
It's the first of 3 times, South Carolinians, those people did not like to have somebody else telling them what to do. So
still don't.
I know.
Still don't.
The late Lewis Jones up at Wofford said we had 3 revolutions in South Carolina: 1719, 1776, 1860. We're batting .660. 2/3. 2 out of 3 succeeded.
Mm-hmm. Wow. We're actually sitting in what I would call my man room or my man cave right now, where we do our podcast. It's also my gun room where I keep my gun cabinet.
I feel safe. That's for sure.
I'm actually looking at my grandfather's Brown Bess smoothbore muzzle loading rifle from my great grandfather or so. It goes back that far. And the history that rifle embodies is, I love looking at it. It's been restored, but we actually found it in a barn. My grandfather found it in a barn 100 years ago and had it restored, and it actually had my the serial number, the name and rank of my ancestor rolled up into the barrel, and it was put in the rafters of this old barn that was eventually inherited by my father in Horry County. And so anyway, I've just always been fascinated with that history, that portion of history, and you're about to get to it, right? I mean, so we've just gotten to the proprietor. Through the proprietors, there was a second group of proprietors and a third group too, right?
No, well, there was an original group, and they had some successors, but the original 8 proprietary shares, some were sold, some were inherited. When the king took over South Carolina. They bought out all of the proprietors but one. Lord Carteret said he was going to keep land, and the land he kept is in what's now North Carolina.
Okay.
But royal government came in 1721. It began to fall apart in 1771 over a variety of issues. Most of them really local, as opposed to international, as it were.
Well,
and it all boiled down to is who was going to run things here in South Carolina.
Well, I'm glad you brought it back.
So happened to match up.
I'm glad you brought it back to South Carolina, because you hear often about the national stuff that happened. I forget the excise tax that eventually, and then the Tea Party. I mean, you hear all of that, but you don't often hear the South Carolina side of things. And so talk about that. How did it start to fall apart here in South Carolina?
Well, there were a number of clashes between our General Assembly in those days was called the Commons House of Assembly. It's basically the House of Representatives. It was a one-house body. There was a council, but that was appointed by the king, which not really the forebear of the Senate, but some people said that it was an upper house, so to speak. The Commons House was a pretty forceful organization, body, and they would get into a contest as who is going to control how the money collected, tax money, is going to be spent. And
sounds familiar.
But by the late 1760s, the royal government was trying to take more and more charge of that, and the Commons House said, we're not buying it. So really after 1770, for all practical purposes, royal government really doesn't function very well, because the Commons would be elected, and then they would do something the governor didn't like, and so he had the power to send them home, dissolve them, and have another election. And South Carolina, beginning with the Stamp Act Congress in 1765, had participated in intercolonial cooperation in opposition to what the king was doing. And in fact, they had passed resolutions, our Commons House did in 1765, that were far more radical than anything that ever came out of the Continental Congress, including the Declaration of Independence. I mean, it specified the things that the king and his officials were doing wrong, and they said, only we, the Commons House of Assembly, has the authority to tax the people of South Carolina. Now, that didn't sit very well when it got back to Parliament, but they were already thinking revolutionary thoughts, if you will.
Independent revolutionary thoughts.
And the people who were in the Commons House were very well educated folks. And this is a statistic that always blows people's minds. If you wanted to have a good education, particularly if you were going to go into law or politics, you went to England to study at the Inns of Court, get your law degree in London. South Carolina, more South Carolinians were trained in the English law schools at the Inns of Court than all the other 12 colonies combined.
Wow. That is pretty compelling. And that's because, I mean, most of the people you hear about from our area, Manigos, for instance, some of the wealthiest people in the world during that period of time, the rice plantations that existed here in South Carolina, clearly built on the back of slave labor, but still some of the wealthiest endeavors in the entire world at the time, correct?
Well, in the colonies, not in the world. But South Carolina was the wealthiest colony in British North America.
And that, I mean, our rice production, it was sold all over the world, from what I understand.
Well, legally usually it's not all over the world. We had a special most things had to be shipped directly to England. South Carolina had an exception. They could ship rice directly to Portugal, which was a major rice market for the Mediterranean. Now they could ship rice to other English colonies, but in terms of going elsewhere, the English pretty much controlled things. Now, the indigo, up until the Revolution, indigo was a very important crop, especially because they had a subsidy from the British government for producing indigo. So not only what the crop brought in market, but when it landed in England, they got a subsidy from the government for producing indigo, which was used in the textile industry for dyeing cloth. So South Carolinians were making money off the mother country as early as 1706. This was the only colony first on that began, the balance of trade between the mother country and the colony is supposed to go the other way. South Carolina was making money. And one way people were making money was lending it. And by statute, for most of the colonial period, the interest rate was supposed to be 10%. Now, Senator, don't you think that would be a good thing for the General Assembly to say that we could put our money out and have to get 10%?
Have to get 10%. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how 10%. That actually works. Yeah, I'd love it. I'd love it if you could actually figure out how it works on the other end. Yeah, who's getting the short end of the stick?
Well, in those days, businessmen, people who would become farmers and planters, would borrow money, and that's how they would purchase labor. That's how they would purchase seeds and what have you. And given the steady increase in the profits that they were making, usually in 2 or 3 years they could pay off their debt. And somebody else is, we're continually welcoming people to South Carolina, and they need something to get started, so they borrow money and they got to pay the interest.
Right. Now you mentioned seeds, and that's one of the other things I want to talk to you about. And I know we're getting close to the end, so if you want to talk about something fun, please jump in and change the topic. But I've also always been interested in sort of the evolution of seeds in South Carolina and how people came to craft a rice culture, came to craft a tobacco culture, a indigo culture, a cotton culture here in South Carolina, and where those seeds came from and how they evolved and how they were adapted. And I mean, it was just incredible that people in those days had the ability to do that. And do you have any information, any knowledge on that? I'm sure you do.
This is almost another 45 minutes.
It is.
Hey, I know. I'm sitting here. How about my questions? I'm over here going, all right, you guys did a great job. I'll see y'all next week. That's a good question.
Rice seeds, there are two sources. One, they came directly from Africa. The other, that they came from Italy, because they did grow rice in the Mediterranean, brought in that way. But under the Lord's proprietors, they experimented with all sorts of different crops. And it took a while for rice to catch on. They tried tobacco, which obviously doesn't grow very well in the swamps of the low country. They tried cotton, and that did not work. Based upon what happened later, that's pretty interesting too. But by the time you get to about 1700, rice has become a commercial crop, and the demand for it in Europe seems to be insatiable. So it built, lots of fortunes. There have been economic histories done of the colonies, and in 1775, there's a list of the 10 richest Americans in 1775. 9 of the 10 are South Carolinians.
Yeah, that's just amazing. I've heard that statistic before, and and all directly related to land and rice production, right?
Well, that and also trade. The deerskin trade was an incredible part of some of the early fortunes were made.
Right. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, I've been interested in that. Obviously, they wiped the bison, the American buffalo, the bison out west. And you know, how is it that the deer population in South Carolina survived the commercial hunting? I mean,
well,
go ahead.
The deerskin trade, our fur traders, as they call themselves, were trading all the way to the Mississippi River with the Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians. But there were tens of thousands of deerskin shipped out of South Carolina every year. Now, when I first married in 1966, my wife's family had a lot of property in Calhoun and Lexington County, and I asked my father-in-law about hunting. He said, "Son, there's not any deer around here." They weren't then, but now they're eating somebody's petunias off the front porch.
Right.
They're everywhere.
Right. Right.
So,
and I've anecdotally heard the same thing. 100 years ago, there was no deer. You know, during my grandfather's time, before he went to World War II, he didn't hunt because there was no deer. I mean, they hunted quail and maybe turkey and duck, but the deer population had really hadn't come back until the 70s, 80s in South Carolina, and I don't know if that's directly related to the commercial hunting that happened, you know, from 200 years ago to 100 years ago, but certainly seems like there was less deer 100 years ago than there are now.
I would say anecdotally, I think you're right. Now the folks at DNR may say something different, but there are deer now where there never used to be.
Right. Right.
And there are lots of them, and I don't think they're some of the deer herds I've seen, I don't think they're nearly as healthy as they were 50 or 60 years ago either. The deer are smaller.
Right. You know, I Hobcall is just down the road from us here, and the Baruchs have an interesting history in South Carolina, as I'm sure you know. And I have gone through that house dozens of times and looked at all the pictures, and I cannot think of one picture of a deer that I've seen killed on Hobcall in any of those ancient photos. There's lots of turkeys, there's lots of quail, there's lots of ducks, but I can't think of one deer that I saw a picture of in the Hobcall house. And obviously, I mean, that was a place where presidents came and hunted and fished, and the Prime Minister of England came and hunted and fished. So you would think that you would have seen a deer picture at some point in time, but no.
Would you not have loved to have sat down for an hour with Bill?
Yeah.
Oh.
I mean, just an hour. I mean, give me an hour, like to sit down and just talk.
Amazing, yeah.
Oh, those pictures are incredible. The history, good Lord, down there.
Yeah. Dr. Edgar, you have anything else, any concluders, anything you want to talk about before we let you run? We've kept you on for a little longer than we expected, but it's been a fantastic conversation.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation. We can have it again.
Would love to.
But as your co-host said, you know, we're just having a conversation like some good friends and good old boys. Next time it needs to be on a dock with an appropriate beverage, I think.
Well, we can
accommodate that.
Because I still didn't get to my list of questions, so that would be great. We'll do that part 2. We've had to do that with quite a few people because, you know, we're thinking an hour like, oh, you can cover so much. But then when you start looking at the clock, it's like winded down. And I really had some stuff that I wanted to touch base on. So we're gonna hold you to that maybe in a couple months and sit back down and circle back up again. And maybe we will do it in person, face to face somewhere.
I'd love to do that. South Carolina history deserves more than an hour.
Absolutely.
You know, it just does. And you do a fantastic job bringing it to us. We thank you so much. And Dr. Walter Edgar, thank you, sir.
Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Y'all take care.
Trilogy Outdoors is produced and edited by Trilogy Outdoors Media. Be sure to follow us on all the podcast platforms as well as our social media pages on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And also don't forget our other brands, Southern English Radio Show and Walk 'Em All Outdoor Magazine. To find more information, visit TrilogyOutdoorsMedia.com. And remember, if it's anything dealing with fins, fur, and feathers, you're going to find it right here on Trilogy Outdoors.